Hello, I'm John Molesky. Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Steve Coll. Steve is currently an editor at The Economist and is an award-winning journalist who previously had long runs as a staff writer for The New Yorker and as an editor and writer for The Washington Post. While at the Post, he received the Pulitzer Prize for Explanatory Journalism in 1990. Steve is also the author of 9 books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Ghost Wars. His newest book is this one, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the origins of America's invasion of Iraq. Steve, great to have you. Terrific piece of work. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, I was thinking about how to begin, and we often say that journalists do the first draft of history, and you covered this in real time, and we're part of that. But now here we are 2 decades later, and you've revisited the story. So now you're sort of in the historian lane. Could you now, with all the benefit of that hindsight and the benefit of the archive of the treasure trove of documents you got to peruse as you wrote the book, can you place this in historical context for us, the U.S. invasion of Iraq?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, the 2003 invasion turned out to be one of the most consequential events in American life in the post-Cold War era. The origins of it became instantly controversial because the war was advertised as a preemptive necessity to address the threat of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. But of course, once troops got there, they discovered there were no WMD stocks as advertised. And that set off a national reckoning that lasted for years, was a very hot political subject. And it was often focused on why the American intelligence was wrong and why the George W. Bush administration made the decisions that it made, and so on. All along, there was another question that seemed really important, which was why did Saddam surrender his regime, his power, ultimately his life, by creating the impression that he had WMD when, in fact, he did not? What was his contribution to this? What was he thinking? So that's where this inquiry began. As you say, I was a reporter who covered Iraq on and off and was around for some of the first draft of this history, but I discovered that the question of what Saddam was thinking might be answerable because he kept these records and tape recordings of his leadership conversations that documented what he was saying and thinking at various points of his conflict with the United States. So that became the launching pad for this 4 or 5 year project.
And tell us about the process by which you gained access to these documents.
So they have a tangled history, but the short version is that they were captured by the United States after the invasion. They were archived, reviewed, curated, and for a brief period around 2008, some of them were released for public scholarly and journalistic use through a center at the National Defense University. Then they were withdrawn some years later, around 2015, ostensibly for budgetary reasons, which may be the explanation, but there's a little bit of mystery around it. So when I came into the picture around 2018, none of them was available for public use. And so I used the Freedom of Information Act request to seek them. I identified where they were in the Pentagon. That's where they were being held. And with advice from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, a nonprofit, I ultimately had to file a lawsuit against the Pentagon asking for some of these materials. And I received them through a settlement of that suit.
And I'm guessing this was the beginning of a major deep dive into translation and all the other things necessary for you to make sense of this. What jumped out at you initially? Were there things that were changing the narrative in your mind? We usually cover history from the perspective of the winners. You were looking at it from the perspective of the losers. What were some of the shifts that started to occur for you? Because this was a story you knew very well from the U.S. perspective.
Well, I think one theme was the extent to which Saddam saw himself battling a permanent conspiracy against him, waged by the CIA, Israel, and the Iranian Revolution. I think he genuinely believed, or at least often was persuaded, that Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, which was so hostile to him and to the United States, was actually a product of American engineering, and that it was all directed at him. And these suspicions, though they might seem irrational or crazy to us, they were really a bedrock conviction that surfaced again and again. And it's not, once you get into the details and listen to him on the tapes and read the transcripts, it's not as if he had no evidence for this. For example, you recall the Iran-Contra scandal of 1986. Well, that took place when the CIA was secretly helping Saddam with satellite photography in the hope that he would not lose the war he had started with Iran. And at the same time, it was revealed that the US was double dealing, had gone in with Israel to supply Iran with missiles and military equipment and intelligence to help Iran in its war against Iraq. Now, Saddam saw this scandal as just confirmation of what he already believed, which was that the United States was not to be trusted and that there was a deeper conspiracy at work in the Middle East. And this conviction stayed with him all the way up towards 2003. You can see on the tapes what later he's debating with aides about how he should handle his relations with the United States, whether he should cooperate with the United Nations. And he points back to the 1980s and he says, in effect, that conspiracy that was revealed in 1986, it's still with us, gentlemen, and that's why we're going to be defiant.
Perhaps, paranoia drove his sense that the United States was almost super powered in its ability to gather intelligence or to create this invisible hand of manipulation. In your sense of Saddam, was this more about him as a paranoid individual, or did his lieutenants and others in the story also share this notion that the United States had these abilities?
I think it was, yeah, it's a good question. I think that he does a lot of the talking, and his lieutenants don't often speak honestly about their own analysis. But in the Q&A, you can see that his diplomats are pressing him to relent a little bit and to entertain the possibility that normal relations with the United States might be possible, and that not everything is part of an effort to oust him from power or to punish Iraq, and that there might be a pathway for him to improve Iraq's standing by engaging in negotiations or cooperation with the United States. And it's not as if he says, never, never over my dead body, but he's much more suspicious about the United States than many of his aides in this dialogue.
Steve, how did you go about being fair to Saddam Hussein as you tried to get inside his head? We're talking about a dictator, a ruthless murderer, and for the process of being a fair reporter, you don't want to come in with all of this negativity about the character as you try to figure him out. How did you build those firewalls for yourself as you work through this?
I guess I thought that as a writer, I had sort of permission to try to really empathize with him without sanitizing him. That's the balance, right? So
Yeah.
you do need to understand him as a human being and to try to see the world from behind his eyes. And to do that, you do kind of have to suspend judgment in some respects, to remind yourself that, while his behavior was outrageous and he hung for war crimes, justifiably, that he was also, at times charismatic, at times generous. He maintained stable relationships within his family for the most part and with his comrades. So he was not like a troubled individual from day to day. He was quite comfortable in his own skin. And that allows you to sort of start to think about the problems he confronted from his perspective and to try to make some sense of the choices he makes and the analysis he brings to bear.
The history books are filled with the headliners, right? The people whose names are on the marquee of these stories, and they become almost household names. And yet, when you dive as deeply as you did into a story, you find all these other characters who may be even more significant but aren't known to history. In the book, you list early in the book a cast of characters. From that cast of characters, who did you discover who maybe was not on your radar previously, who jumps out as really important to understanding this story?
Well, I tried to build some of the story of Iraq's WMD program, the kind of unraveling the mystery of what really happened and why there was nothing there when we went in 2003, through the physicist who was identified by his own peers as sort of the Robert Oppenheimer of the Iraqi nuclear program, Jafar Dia Jafar, a fascinating character, still alive in his 80s, living in Dubai, educated in Britain as an atomic physicist, theoretical physicist, a particle physicist. He worked at one of the most prestigious particle accelerators in Europe, in Geneva, and then was recruited home by Saddam. But he had an ambivalent relationship, mutually ambivalent, with Saddam's regime. In fact, he never was a member of the Ba'ath Party. And he came under suspicion at a certain point and was arrested, detained for more than a year. And then Saddam more or less coerced him, invited him into becoming the father of an Iraqi nuclear bomb. And he successfully oversaw a program that remained secret for a decade. And I was able to meet with him in Dubai, interview him, and then entered into a long correspondence with him. And I thought his life, the complexity of his own patriotism, his own decision to help Saddam, but also his own kind of distance from Saddam, might help us understand some of the complexity of what this regime was outside of the center point of the dictatorship.
One way to summarize the story that you uncover is sort of an attempt by Saddam Hussein to have his cake and eat it, right? To have the threat of WMD while still having a clean inspection. It's almost as if his failed bluff cost him his life. Is that a fair analysis of what happened? And is there any insight into why he tried to have it both ways?
Yeah, I think the kind of idea of having his cake and eat it too is a fair summary of, a number of interacting motivations. He basically feared being exposed as weak, feared that his enemies would take advantage if he admitted fully that he had disarmed, as he was required to do after the Kuwait War, when he was expelled from Kuwait after invading and occupying the country. So he didn't want to be held accountable for holding weapons that he didn't feel that he really needed that much. At the same time, he didn't want to be exposed as vulnerable, either to his external enemies, Iran and Israel, or to generals in his own regime. But in addition to that, he concluded, and not without reason, that honesty wouldn't pay in the system that he was confronting after the Kuwait War, after the Gulf War. He had been very heavily sanctioned. His goal was to get out of sanctions and to be able to sell oil again and rebuild Iraq. But the sanctions were conditional on him satisfying these inspections. And he suspected that it was all a game, that he would never really be given credit. And at the same time, he didn't want to make it easy for the inspectors by leaving weapons around for them to find. So he secretly destroyed all this stuff and then lied about it and didn't come forward. And so he ended up sowing quite a lot of confusion, which led right up until 2003. But I think his conclusion that honesty wouldn't pay, which is in the transcripts quite a lot, he's constantly telling his comrades who are urging cooperation on him that you may think that if we do this or that we'll get credit for it. I'm telling you, I know how the world is organized against Iraq, and we're not going to get credit. And in 1997, the Clinton administration, in its second term, its Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, delivered a speech in which she made it explicit that even if Saddam did disarm, even if he did pass all of the inspections, that the United States would not lift sanctions until Saddam was gone from power. Well, that just confirmed what he had been saying for years. Honesty doesn't pay. We can either have sanctions with all of these people running around with their clipboards, violating our sovereignty and our dignity, or we can have sanctions without them. And so he threw them out. And that exacerbated the blindness in the West as in the heated months after 9/11.
And why did U.S. intelligence miss this?
Well, I think there was a dynamic of mirroring that developed in the 90s during the inspections, in which, on the one hand, there were unanswered questions about the extent and history of Saddam's WMD program. They were unanswered because he hadn't been orderly or transparent about the subjects of these programs. Even though he had destroyed his weapon stocks, he hadn't really answered the questions in a straightforward way. So there were questions. But when the inspectors looked for hidden materials or for hidden documents, they triggered a response from Iraqi security services that they interpreted as evidence that Iraq was still hiding dangerous weapons. But in fact, what was happening was that his bodyguards were afraid that other regime secrets about his own security were the real target of these inspectors, because these were really assassins in white coats or coup makers under UN guise. And so they would scramble to deflect the inspectors. That created an impression among Western intelligence agencies. Oh, well, obviously they're hiding these weapons. Well, no, they were hiding something, but it wasn't the weapons. It was regime security. And it wasn't until after this was all over that this kind of mutually reinforcing confusion became apparent. But at the time, every bit of evidence about Saddam's response to the inspection was interpreted as evidence of deception and of danger.
Another part of the mythology is the alleged assassination attempt on George Herbert Walker Bush, and supposedly part of George W. Bush's motivation beyond WMD. Your book challenges whether or not that actually happened. What did your research indicate about that story?
Well, just to briefly set the stage, after George H.W. Bush's presidency in early 1993, he visited Kuwait, the country he had led a coalition of military forces to liberate, and he was celebrated, welcomed by the emir. Spent several days there. His son Jeb was with him. Laura Bush, George W.'s wife, was in the entourage. And they went around Kuwait, and the president gave some talks, and then they left without incident. Nothing happened while they were there. About a week later, the Kuwaitis announced that they had foiled an assassination plot. As evidence, they pointed to a vehicle bomb, an SUV bomb, that they had discovered in a warehouse in Kuwait City. The CIA and the FBI went out to investigate, and they determined that this vehicle bomb was of Iraqi origin. But the evidence was that the Iraqis had made this bomb during the occupation of Kuwait, and they had spread some of these vehicles around the Gulf, and they dated to way before Bush had visited. The next thing the Kuwaitis produced were some whiskey smugglers who they said had been sent to use this bomb to blow up George H.W. Bush. But these were hapless characters who were given a rough interrogation and delivered confessions of questionable reliability. Bottom line, when you added up all the evidence, Sandy Berger, who was then Bill Clinton's deputy national security advisor, said, this is a setup. I don't believe this. You have not persuaded the court that this was an assassination plot. But he lost the argument, and Clinton ultimately retaliated and endorsed the idea that this had been a genuine assassination. One thing that's new is that with all these records and all these tapes, some researchers who have had access to all of them, which I did not have access to everything, they used all kinds of word search terms, and they searched them as vigorously as they could. They couldn't find a single piece of evidence that this had been Saddam's doing.
I know you've said that it would have been impossible for a U.S. president to pick up the phone and speak to Saddam Hussein just based on U.S. politics, or at least U.S. politicians have said that. Bill Clinton, I think, among them. But was there any indication of back channel discussions between Iraq and the U.S., or was this just flying blind from both sides?
It was flying blind from both sides. I think there was a desire on the Iraqi side to initiate back channel discussions, but the Clinton administration declined to do that, even when the opportunity arose. And the George W. Bush administration turned aside a similar opportunity in the fall of 2001. The Iraqis wanted the back channel because they wanted to get out of sanctions, and they thought talking about subjects of common interest with the United States might help them. And there were subjects of common interest. how to contain the Iranian Revolution, how to deal with Islamist terrorism. Would Iraq play a more constructive role in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process? There were many things that had been subjects of mutual interest during the 1980s, but that were now off the table in the 90s. The Clinton administration declined to take up any of those channels. I think partly they were afraid that if they did so, they would weaken the sanctions coalition if these contacts were exposed. But I also think they were trying a full pressure strategy, and they wanted Saddam to stew in his own juices. But I'm afraid that it deprived them of opportunities to learn about some of the complexities of the regime and the way it was handling WMD that might have challenged the conventional groupthink about what was really going on in Iraq.
The promotional material for your book and some of the blurbs, human error, hubris, miscalculation, these are words that turn up frequently. Given the human nature that is revealed in this story, whether it's looking inside Saddam's palace or looking inside the White House, other than that, are there lessons to be learned? Are there takeaways? Are there ways that U.S. intelligence could do a better job? Or anything that jumps to mind for you that could be applied as we move forward?
Well, I think we've covered a couple of them. I do think that having contact, even with your adversaries, even if it's done in secret through intelligence channels, is better than not having contact. Just simply for the sake of collecting information, because we missed the fact that, for example, at the time of 9/11, Saddam, now in his 60s, was no longer the same person as he had been 15 years before, and he'd become obsessed with writing novels. And what if we had learned that? Would we have paused or rethought? Possibly not, but in any event, why not collect the information? So that's one lesson. I think he also presents a kind of paradox, because while we ultimately made this misjudgment because we failed to understand who he was and how he thought, so there's clearly an argument for making a continuous effort to try to empathize with even, very morally affronting characters like him in order to just see the world the way he does, and to try to evaluate his decisions more accurately. So on the one hand, that's a lesson. On the other hand, I think in Saddam's case, he was so aggressive, so erratic, he invaded two neighbors without provocation, that if I were the unlucky person who was the president in charge of managing him, I would be tempted not to trust even well-informed judgments about what Saddam was planning to do, and I might be tempted to go back to the classic formula of international relations, which is when you have a dangerous adversary, focus on their capabilities and try to send clear deterrence messages. I think maybe the most interesting lesson from Saddam's case is that as rash as he was, and as aggressive and norm-breaking as his actions were, he was deterrable. And we did successfully deter him at times, for example, from using chemical weapons against U.S. troops during the Gulf War.
I'm always fascinated when I speak to someone who has done such a deep dive and has spent years working on a book, not these things that you see churned out in a couple of months. Now you shift from that depth and that focus to the book tour, where you're hearing what people like me think about the book, or what questions we have. And I'm wondering, Steve, is there anything that we've been missing? The collective group of interviewers you've encountered as you've been out promoting the book. Are there aspects of this story that we've ignored, that we just didn't see for how important they are?
Well, I think, this is I'm afraid a kind of historian's answer, but it's these conflicts that we continue to manage today, whether with Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un in North Korea. They unfold over long periods of time, and we tend to manage them as fixed, static conflicts. But in fact, they are dynamic and subtle, and they're full of nuance. And it's very difficult, I think, for a president with so many responsibilities to maintain the level of concentration or to collect the level of information that's required to keep up with the nuances of these relationships. But president should expect that level of fidelity and free thinking and re-examination of assumptions continuously, because I think the lesson of these long narrative histories is that they do change, that simply dismissing a dangerous adversary through caricature or demonization deprives you of vital insight that is necessary to protect the national security interests of the country. And only hard work will get you there. Now, I have the luxury of having hindsight and having evidence that wouldn't be available to a president in real time. But I think what I take away from this is that you really do need to insist that those arms of your government that can deliver those insights work on it, and in a free thinking way, free of political and sort of groupthink straitjackets as best as possible. We're human beings. We're not going to always get it right. And the last lesson, of course, is a level of humility about what you don't know.
Yeah, always a lesson worth revisiting. Congratulations on an epic piece of work. Thank you for joining us today. I should also mention to our viewers and listeners that you have generously donated a lot of the assets you worked with that are now going to be part of the Wilson Center's digital archive. And so on behalf of our history and public policy program, sincere thanks for that generous offer.
Oh, well, I'm grateful to the center for housing them and for curating them. It's a shame that these records are not available in full to all researchers, because they do provide a very rare case study of a dictatorship from the inside. But I'm very glad that what I was able to extract through this lawsuit will be available to researchers through the efforts and investments of the Woodrow Wilson Center. So it's a great partnership, and I'm happy to be involved.
Great. Thanks again. And thanks again. And congratulations again on the book. To
Thank
our
you.
viewers, hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching. And again, the book is The Achilles Trap by Steve Call. Thank you.